The judge leaned back in her chair, a smug smile playing on her lips as she eyed the man before her. His suit was worn, his hands clenched at his sides, yet his eyes held a quiet strength she chose to ignore. She chuckled, shaking her head as she prepared to deliver a verdict she had already decided long before the trial began. The courtroom was silent, the weight of her power undeniable. But what she didn't know, what no one in that room could have predicted, was that within minutes, the balance of power would shift. And this time, it wouldn't be the man standing before her who faced judgment. It would be her. The courtroom buzzed with murmurs as the judge adjusted her robe and glanced down at the man standing before her. The air was thick with tension, the kind that made people shift uncomfortably in their seats. Judge Evelyn Carter was known for her stern rulings, but today there was something else in her demeanor. A smirk, a gleam of superiority in her eyes as she looked at the defendant, a black man named Daniel Harris. Daniel stood tall, his hands cuffed in front of him, his expression calm but unreadable. He had been accused of theft, a crime he vehemently denied. He wasn't a criminal. He was a hard-working man, a father, a husband. But to Judge Carter, he was just another case, another name in her book. She leaned forward, tapping her gavel against the wood. "Mr. Harris, I must say your story is unbelievable at best." A chuckle escaped her lips, and some in the courtroom exchanged uneasy glances. The prosecutor, a young and eager woman, straightened her posture, sensing an easy victory. The judge continued, "You expect this court to believe that you just happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time? That the security footage was mistaken? How convenient." Daniel's attorney, Michael, a composed and sharp-witted man, stood up. "Your Honor, if I may, my client has provided an alibi that proves." Judge Carter raised a hand, silencing him. "Enough. I don't need a lecture on procedure, counselor. I've seen men like Mr. Harris come through my courtroom before, and I know how this ends." Daniel clenched his jaw, but said nothing. He had grown used to moments like this. Being doubted. Being judged before he even had a chance to speak. But something inside him told him to wait, to let the moment play out. Judge Carter exhaled dramatically, flipping through the case file. "Let's just speed this up, shall we? The evidence is clear. Mr. Harris, you are." The doors to the courtroom suddenly burst open. A court clerk rushed inside, out of breath, holding a folder with trembling hands. "Your Honor, we have an urgent development in this case." Judge Carter scowled. "What is the meaning of this interruption?" The clerk hesitated, then stepped closer, whispering something in the judge's ear. Whatever it was made her face darken instantly. The smirk vanished. Her fingers trembled slightly as she took the folder and flipped it open. The silence in the room was deafening as the judge's eyes darted across the pages. Then, something happened that no one expected. Judge Carter's hand slipped and the folder fell to the ground, papers scattering across the floor. Her face, usually so controlled, drained of color. The prosecutor frowned. "Your Honor." But Judge Carter didn't respond immediately. She swallowed hard and adjusted herself in her seat, her voice no longer filled with arrogance, but with something else, uncertainty. "Mr. Harris," she hesitated, clearing her throat. "It seems there has been a mistake." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Daniel raised an eyebrow, but remained silent, watching her carefully. The prosecutor leaned forward. "A mistake." Judge Carter clenched her jaw, looking visibly uncomfortable. She turned to the bailiff. "Release Mr. Harris immediately." Gasps filled the courtroom. The prosecutor jumped up. "But Your Honor, the evidence." Judge Carter cut her off. The evidence was tampered with. Her voice was lower now, almost as if she didn't want to admit it. She looked at Daniel, for the first time really looking at him. "Mr. Harris, you were framed." The weight of her words sent a shockwave through the courtroom. Daniel's attorney stepped forward, his tone firm. "Who tampered with it?" The judge hesitated, glancing at the clerk, who nodded slowly, confirming what they had just uncovered. Judge Carter's lips pressed into a thin line. "An internal investigation is already underway. It appears that someone with access to the case wanted Mr. Harris convicted." Daniel took a deep breath. He had suspected as much, but hearing it from the judge herself was something else entirely. His attorney wasn't done. Who was it? The judge's eyes flickered with something that looked like fear. For a brief second, it seemed like she was weighing her words carefully. Then, her gaze moved across the room and settled on the prosecutor. A sharp intake of breath. The prosecutor's eyes widened. "You can't be serious." Judge Carter exhaled. "Ms. Reynolds, I need you to turn over your case files to the clerk immediately." The prosecutor's face twisted in disbelief, then anger. "This is ridiculous. I have done nothing wrong." The bailiff stepped forward. "Ma'am, you need to comply." A moment of silence passed. Then the prosecutor grabbed her briefcase and stormed out of the courtroom, her heels clicking furiously against the floor. Judge Carter rubbed her temples, looking more drained than anyone had ever seen her. Daniel, now free from his cuffs, flexed his wrists and looked directly at the judge. "So what happens now?" Judge Carter met his gaze, her voice quieter than before. "Now, Mr. Harris, justice." But the way she said it, the way her fingers curled slightly over the bench, hinted that she knew this was far from over. And deep inside, she felt something she hadn't in a long time: dread. Daniel could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him like a storm about to break. The courtroom, once a place where he felt powerless, now held an eerie silence. Judge Carter's words echoed in his mind: justice. But justice for whom? For him, who had nearly lost his freedom to a rigged system. For the judge, who now found herself entangled in a case that threatened her authority. Or for the prosecutor, who had fled like a guilty animal sensing the hunter's gaze. Something didn't sit right. The judge's fingers tapped against the bench, a nervous habit she had no doubt tried to break over the years. Daniel recognized it for what it was: fear. The woman who had mocked him just moments ago, the woman who had treated him like a foregone conclusion, was now rattled. And Daniel knew fear like an old acquaintance. He had seen it in men who realized too late that their lies were about to be exposed. He had felt it himself years ago, when he had been pulled over for no reason other than the color of his skin, when the officer's hand had rested too easily on his holster. Fear was not foreign to him, but seeing it in the eyes of a judge, that was new. The bailiff moved toward the judge, whispering something Daniel couldn't hear. But he saw the way her shoulders tensed, the way her fingers curled slightly as if trying to grip something solid in the chaos unraveling before her. She cleared her throat and turned to the room. "Court is adjourned," she said, her voice lacking its usual steel. The gavel came down with a dull thud. People began murmuring, some rising from their seats, others hesitating, sensing that this was not an ordinary ending to a trial. Daniel looked at his lawyer, Michael, who nodded once. "We need to move quickly," he said under his breath. "Something's not right." Daniel knew that already. He could feel it in his bones. He turned his gaze back to the judge, watching as she gathered her papers with unsteady hands. Whatever was in that folder had shaken her to the core. But why? If someone had tampered with the evidence, why wasn't she calling for an immediate investigation? Why had she let the prosecutor leave so easily? His mind raced. He had come in today expecting the worst. Instead, he had walked away a free man. But freedom felt like a fragile thing at this moment, as if it could be snatched away at any second. As Daniel and Michael stepped toward the exit, a man in a dark suit intercepted them. His face was expressionless, but his eyes held a quiet intensity. "Mr. Harris," he said, his voice smooth but firm. "My name is Agent Caldwell. I need to speak with you." Michael stepped forward immediately, placing a protective hand on Daniel's arm. "And you are with?" "Internal Affairs," Caldwell answered. "This case is bigger than you realize." Judge Carter was not acting alone. A cold chill ran down Daniel's spine. He glanced back at the judge, who was now hurriedly leaving through a side door, her head lowered. He turned to Caldwell. "Then who was—" Caldwell's lips pressed into a thin line. "We don't know yet. But what I do know is that your life is in danger." The words settled like a heavy stone in Daniel's stomach. He had spent the last few weeks worrying about proving his innocence. Now, he had to worry about staying alive. Michael scoffed, folding his arms. This sounds like a setup. My client is free. He's not going anywhere with you, without a proper explanation. Caldwell sighed, glancing around as if making sure no one else was listening. The prosecutor didn't just leave, she ran. And Judge Carter, she's not in control of this situation anymore. There are people who wanted you behind bars, Mr. Harris, and they won't stop just because the case fell apart. Daniel clenched his jaw. He had always known the system was rigged against people like him. But this was something darker, something deeper. He exchanged a glance with Michael, who gave a slow nod. All right, Daniel said. Tell me everything. Caldwell led them out of a courthouse and into a black sedan parked along the curb. The moment they were inside, he pulled out a file and handed it to Daniel. You weren't just framed, he said. You were targeted. Daniel flipped open the file, his eyes scanning the contents. Surveillance photos, financial records, court documents. His name was in multiple places, but so were others. Judge Carter, Prosecutor Reynolds, and another name that made his breath catch, Senator Malcolm Reed. What does he have to do with this? Daniel asked, his voice quiet but sharp. Caldwell tapped the folder. Reed has deep ties to certain organizations. Powerful ones. Ones that don't want men like you walking free. Michael frowned. Are we talking about corruption or something worse? Caldwell met his gaze. Both. Daniel exhaled slowly, his fingers gripping the edge of the file. This wasn't just about him anymore. This was about something much larger. What do you need me to do? Caldwell hesitated, then leaned forward. You need to disappear for a while. Michael's head snapped up. Excuse me. If they know you're still a threat, they'll come after you, Caldwell explained. We need to figure out exactly who is pulling the strings before they find another way to silence you. Daniel shook his head. No, I'm not running. Not after everything I've been through. Caldwell's eyes darkened. Then you better be ready for what comes next. The next few hours were a blur. Caldwell took them to a safe house, a small apartment with minimal furniture and thick blinds covering the windows. Daniel sat at the worn-out kitchen table, his mind spinning. He had always believed that if you told the truth, if you did the right thing, eventually justice would prevail. But now, justice felt like a mirage, something he could see but never quite reach. Michael sat across from him, rubbing his temples. This is insane, he muttered. We should go to the press. No, Caldwell said firmly. Not yet. If we move too soon, we lose any advantage we have. We need to let them think Daniel is out of the picture. Daniel clenched his fists. He wasn't afraid to fight. He wasn't afraid of the truth. But he was afraid of what would happen if they failed. And what about Judge Carter? He asked. She knows something. You saw how she reacted. Caldwell nodded. She's in over her head. If we push her the right way, she might crack. A knock at the door made them all freeze. Caldwell pulled out a gun, motioning for silence. Another knock. Then a voice. A familiar one. It's Carter. Daniel and Michael exchanged a look before Caldwell slowly opened the door. Judge Carter stepped inside, looking over her shoulder as if she had been followed. She wasn't the arrogant woman from the courtroom anymore. She looked haunted. They know, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. They know you're onto them. Daniel stood. Who? Carter swallowed hard. Reed. The prosecutor. Others. You don't understand, this goes higher than any of us. Michael scoffed. Then why are you here? Carter's hands trembled as she placed a folder on the table. Because if I don't help you, they'll kill me too. Silence fell over the room. Caldwell opened the folder, his face grim as he scanned the pages. Finally, he looked up. This isn't just about a frame job, he said. This is about control, power. And if we don't act fast, we're all dead. Daniel exhaled, his mind made up. He had spent his life following the rules, believing in the system. But now, the only way to get justice was to take it into his own hands. He met Caldwell's gaze. Then let's finish this. Judge Carter's hands trembled as she pushed the folder toward them, her eyes darting to the door as if expecting someone to burst in at any moment. Daniel could see it clearly. This was a woman who had built her entire life on control, on wielding power over others, and now that power had turned against her. She looked smaller than she had in the courtroom, no longer the towering authority figure behind the bench. Now, she was just another pawn in a game she had never truly controlled. Daniel glanced at Caldwell, who had already begun flipping through the documents, his expression unreadable. Michael leaned forward, his jaw tight. "What exactly are we looking at?" he asked. Carter exhaled sharply. "Proof," she said. Proof that the case against Daniel was never about justice. It was about making an example out of him. About keeping people like him, like you, she nodded toward Michael, in check. Her voice wavered, but there was a sharpness underneath, a bitterness that suggested she was only just realizing how expendable she had become in the grand scheme of things. Daniel's fingers curled into fists. He had known this trial wasn't about guilt or innocence, but hearing it confirmed in such stark terms sent a fresh wave of anger through him. He had spent months preparing for his defense, weeks fearing for his future, and now he was being told he had never even had a chance. "Why now?" he asked. "Why are you suddenly so willing to help?" Carter's gaze flickered to Caldwell, then back to Daniel. "Because I don't have a choice," she admitted. "I thought I was part of the system. I thought I understood how it worked. But I was wrong. The moment I hesitated in that courtroom, the moment I let that evidence surface, I signed my own death warrant." She swallowed hard, pressing her hands against the table as if to steady herself. "They'll come for me, just like they came for you. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but soon. And when they do, it won't be in a courtroom. It'll be in a dark alley or a quiet road late at night. They'll make it look like an accident, a robbery gone wrong, a heart attack. They'll erase me like I never existed." Caldwell sighed, rubbing his forehead. "She's not wrong," he muttered. "These people don't play games. If they think you're a liability, you're gone. Just like that." He snapped his fingers. Michael narrowed his eyes. "So what do you suggest? We just sit here and wait for them to make a move?" Caldwell shook his head. "No. We go on the offensive." He tapped the folder. "This isn't just proof of corruption. This is leverage. If we use it the right way, we can turn the tables. We can make them afraid for once." Daniel frowned, flipping through the documents. Names, transactions, a web of connections that stretched far beyond the courthouse. "What exactly am I looking at?" he asked. Carter leaned in, her voice low. "This isn't just about you. This is about an entire network. Judges, prosecutors, politicians. People who have been using the justice system not to uphold the law, but to control it. To decide who wins and who loses before a case even begins. And Senator Reed? He's at the center of it all." Michael let out a low whistle. "If this is real, this is bigger than just one case. This is career-ending. Hell, this is life-ending for some of these people." Caldwell nodded. "Which is why we have to be careful. We can't just walk into a newsroom with this. If we do, they'll shut it down before it ever reaches the public. We need to make sure the right people see it. People they can't silence." Daniel sat back, his mind racing. Every instinct in him screamed to act, to fight back, to make sure these people paid for what they had done. But he also knew that one wrong move could get them all killed. "So what's the plan?" Caldwell glanced at Carter. "First, we need to get her somewhere safe. She's a walking target right now." Carter scoffed. "Now you care about my safety?" Caldwell's eyes darkened. "Let's get one thing straight, Judge. I don't like you. I don't trust you. But right now, we need each other. And if you want to survive, you're going to do exactly what I say. Understood?" Carter hesitated, then nodded. Caldwell turned back to Daniel. "As for you, you're going to do something you've never done before. You're going to disappear." Daniel tensed. "No, I'm not running. Not after everything I've been through." "This isn't running," Caldwell said. "This is strategy. If they think you're out of the picture, they'll lower their guard. That's when we strike." Daniel's jaw clenched, but he nodded. He had spent his whole life fighting to be seen, to be heard. The idea of stepping back, even temporarily, felt wrong. But he also knew Caldwell was right. If he wanted justice, if he wanted the truth to come out, he had to be smart. Michael exhaled, rubbing his temples. And what about the evidence? We can't just sit on it forever. Caldwell smirked. Oh, we won't. We just need to find the right way to release it. A way they can't control. Daniel narrowed his eyes. And what exactly do you have in mind? Caldwell leaned back, a dangerous glint in his eyes. We're going to use their own system against them. The next few days were a whirlwind of careful planning and constant paranoia. Daniel was moved from safe house to safe house, never staying in one place too long. Carter was hidden away as well, under a different alias. Her once powerful presence reduced to whispers in the dark. Michael worked around the clock, making contact with journalists, activists, and legal experts who could help once they were ready to go public. But the real work? That was Caldwell's specialty. He knew how to move in the shadows, how to gather intel without being seen. He had contacts deep within the government, people who were willing to talk if the price or the risk was right. And what he uncovered only made the situation more dangerous. Senator Reed wasn't just involved. He was orchestrating everything. The cases, the rulings, the appointments. He had built an empire of control, ensuring that the right people were in the right places at the right time. And anyone who got in his way, they disappeared. Just like Daniel almost had. Just like Carter almost would have. But Reed had one weakness. He thrived in secrecy. He operated in the dark. If they could drag him into the light, if they could force him into the public eye with undeniable proof, he would crumble. And that's exactly what they planned to do. The final piece of the puzzle was finding a way to release the information without interference. The media couldn't be trusted. Too many hands in too many pockets. But the internet? That was different. They compiled everything, documents, recordings, testimonies, into one massive digital file. A file that, once released, couldn't be taken down. And then, at exactly 7 p.m. on a Sunday night, it happened. The file went live. Social media exploded. News outlets scrambled to verify the information. Within minutes, Reed's name was trending worldwide. People were demanding answers. The government was forced to respond. And somewhere, in the safety of an undisclosed location, Daniel watched it all unfold. He had spent his whole life being told that justice was a privilege, not a right. That people like him had to fight for every scrap of fairness they could get. But now the truth was out. And there was no going back. The real fight was just beginning. The moment the file went live, chaos erupted. News stations scrambled to verify the information. Reporters flooded social media with frantic posts, and the public, furious, betrayed, began demanding answers. It was the kind of storm that couldn't be contained. The kind that no amount of backroom deals or political maneuvering could silence. Senator Reed had spent years constructing an empire built on secrecy, but now, with every passing second, that empire was crumbling. Daniel sat in the dimly lit safe house, his eyes glued to the screen as the media frenzy unfolded. His heart pounded, not just from the thrill of victory, but from the knowledge that this was far from over. They had set the stage for justice, but he knew men like Reed didn't go down without a fight. A notification popped up on the screen, a live broadcast. The senator was about to make a statement. Caldwell leaned forward, his face tense. "Here we go," he muttered. The screen cut to Senator Reed standing behind a podium, his expression composed. But there was something in his eyes, something that betrayed the fear lurking beneath his polished exterior. He cleared his throat, gripping the edges of the podium as if steadying himself. "My fellow Americans," he began, his voice carefully controlled. "Tonight, a series of baseless and outrageous allegations have surfaced against me and my colleagues. Let me be clear. These accusations are nothing more than a politically motivated attack meant to discredit the work we have done to uphold the law." Daniel clenched his fists. Lies. Even now, with the truth out in the open, Reed was trying to manipulate the narrative, twisting reality to suit his needs. Reed continued, his voice gaining confidence. "I assure you, my legal team is already taking action against those responsible for this defamation. We will uncover the true perpetrators behind this smear campaign, and they will be held accountable. Caldwell let out a low chuckle, shaking his head. Of course. Classic move, play the victim, threaten retaliation, hope people buy it. Michael frowned. What if they do buy it? What if he spins this in his favor? Daniel exhaled sharply. He can try, but we didn't just release accusations. We released proof. He can call it fake news all he wants, but the documents don't lie. And the world was already reacting. Social media was ablaze with people dissecting every document, every recording. Former judges, prosecutors, and whistleblowers were coming forward, emboldened by the exposure. Some corroborated the evidence. Others added new details, weaving an even darker web of corruption than Daniel had imagined. But then came the retaliation. The first attack was digital. The website hosting the files went down within an hour. Then came the misinformation campaign. Fake reports claiming the documents had been fabricated. False stories planted to discredit their work. And then the threats. Daniel's burner phone buzzed. An unknown number. He hesitated, then answered. Mr. Carter, a deep voice murmured. You don't know who I am, and you don't need to. But you need to understand something. You've made a very dangerous mistake. Daniel's grip tightened on the phone. Is that so? There was a pause. You think you've won something here? You haven't. You've simply declared war. And in war, people like you don't survive. Daniel's chest tightened. That sounds an awful lot like a threat. It's a promise, the voice said coldly. Walk away now, and you might live to see another day. Keep pushing, and you'll regret it. The line went dead. Daniel lowered the phone, his mind racing. The message was clear. Reed and his allies weren't going to let this go. They had been exposed, but they weren't powerless. They had resources, connections, and a ruthless willingness to do whatever it took to protect themselves. Caldwell watched him carefully. What is it? Daniel met his gaze. They just made it official. We're in a war now. Michael cursed under his breath. So what do we do? Daniel exhaled slowly, his mind sharpening. Fear clawed at the edges of his thoughts, but he shoved it down. This was exactly what they wanted, for him to be afraid, to back down. But he wasn't that man anymore. We don't stop, he said firmly. We hit them harder. The next move had to be strategic. They couldn't just rely on the media. Too many players were already working to suppress the truth. Instead, they turned to the people. They coordinated leaks to independent journalists, podcasters, and online activists who had no ties to corporate interests. They gathered sworn testimonies from whistleblowers who were finally willing to speak. And most importantly, they went after the money. Caldwell had contacts in finance, people who knew how to follow paper trails. Within days, they uncovered offshore accounts, hidden transactions, and damning financial records that proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that Reed and his associates weren't just rigging the justice system. They were profiting from it. Millions in bribes, kickbacks, and laundered money. Then came the moment they had been waiting for. A warrant was issued. The FBI had been forced to act. The public pressure was too great, the evidence too overwhelming. Agents stormed Reed's home at dawn, cameras catching every moment. He was let out in handcuffs, his face a mask of fury and disbelief. Daniel watched the footage with a mix of satisfaction and exhaustion. This was it, the moment he had fought for, the moment they had all risked everything for. But even as Reed was taken away, Daniel knew this wasn't over. The system didn't change overnight. There were still others like Reed, still layers of corruption waiting to be uncovered. As he turned away from the screen, his phone buzzed again. Another unknown number. He hesitated, then answered. A familiar voice chuckled softly. You think this is the end? Daniel's breath caught. He knew that voice. It wasn't Reed. It was someone else. Someone higher up. The voice lowered to a whisper. You've only just begun to see how deep this goes. Then the line went dead. Daniel stood there, the weight of the moment pressing down on him.